My name's Clara, and if you told me a year ago I'd be where I am now, I'd have laughed in your face. Life's been no fairy tale for me. Born and raised in a small town, life handed me lemons, and frankly, the lemonade never did taste sweet. I married young, thinking it was my ticket to a better life. Boy, was I wrong. The marriage tanked, and I was left with a baby boy, Alex, to raise on my own. Fast forward a few decades, and there I was, 51, working my fingers to the bone at the local supermarket. 12-hour shifts, barely making ends meet, and dreaming of a break that seemed like it would never come. Then George walked into my life. He was a few years older, with that silver fox look that can make a woman's heart beat faster. He started coming into the store regularly, always making a beeline for my checkout. We got to talking, and one thing led to another. "Clara, have you ever thought about a different life?" George asked me one evening as we closed down the store, his eyes searching mine. "Different how?" "Like winning the lottery and sipping cocktails on a beach," I joked, locking the doors and turning to face him. "No, I mean with someone who could take care of you, show you a world you've never seen," he said, his voice serious, almost urgent. I laughed a bit too loudly. "George, I'm past dreaming of knights in shining armor. At this point, I'd settle for a decent night's sleep and a day off now and then." But George was persistent. He wooed me like no one ever had. Flowers, dinners out, and long talks about a future together. It was all so fast, so intense. Before I knew it, he was on one knee in that tiny, cramped apartment I called home, asking me to marry him. "Clara, marry me, and you won't have to worry about a thing. I'll take care of you. We'll move to my place in the city. It's big, comfortable. You deserve that and so much more," he said, his eyes gleaming with promises. I was swept off my feet. My heart screamed caution, but my lonely soul whispered, "Why not?" So I said yes. We married in a small ceremony, just a few friends and my son Alex, who looked at George like the father he never had. The day after the wedding, George said, "Pack up, Clara. Let's start our new life. I've got everything planned out." So I did. I sold my apartment, the only real asset I had, and gave George the money for our future, trying to ignore the nagging doubt in my gut. We arrived at his big, comfortable house, and that's when I met the first surprise of my new life. There, in what I thought was our new home, was a man I had never heard of before. He was in a wheelchair, silent, his eyes the only part of him that seemed alive. "Who's this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. George didn't meet my eye. "That's my brother, Carl. He's been like this for years. Paralyzed, can't speak. I take care of him." "Your brother? Why didn't you tell me?" I could feel the anger rising, but there was also a deep sinking feeling of betrayal. "I didn't want to scare you off, and I thought we could take care of him together. It's not easy, but I've managed so far," George said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. I looked at Carl, then back at George. "You could have told me, George. We're supposed to be partners, remember?" I know, I'm sorry. It's just, I need you, Clara. We can make this work, can't we?" George reached out, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't read. And there I was, standing in a stranger's house, my dreams of a new beginning turning to ash. But I've always been a fighter, never one to back down from a challenge. So I rolled up my sleeves, ready to face whatever this new life threw at me. Little did I know this was just the tip of the iceberg. "All right, George, we'll make it work. But no more secrets, okay? We're in this together," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. George smiled, relief washing over his face. "Together," he echoed. But even then, I wondered what I had gotten myself into. Settling into George's house was like stepping into an alternate reality, one I hadn't signed up for. The big, comfortable house he boasted about was more like a full-time care facility, minus the staff. And Carl, the brother I hadn't known existed until we walked through the door, was now my responsibility too. The first few days were a blur of trying to figure out how to care for Carl, maintain the house, and adjust to a life I wasn't prepared for at all. "All right, George, how do we do this? You've got to show me the ropes here," I said one morning, finding George in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee. The sunlight streamed in, casting shadows that seemed too stark for the early hour. George looked up, his eyes weary. "Clara, I know this is a lot. I should have prepared you better. Carl needs constant care, and I've been managing alone, but it's hard." "Managing? You call this managing?" I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "You've been hiding this from me. You think I'm just going to step in and play nurse." "Clara, please." George's voice was low, pleading. "I need your help. It's just until we figure something out. Carl's condition, it's not easy." I took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of anger and betrayal. "Fine, but you're going to teach me everything. I mean everything, George. I'm not a miracle worker." Of course. Thank you, Clara." George seemed genuinely relieved, but it did little to ease my frustration. The following weeks were a crash course in caregiving that I never wanted. George showed me how to lift Carl, change him, and manage his medications. The tasks were daunting and the responsibility weighed heavily on me, part of a family I didn't choose, in a life that felt like a trap. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself adapting out of necessity. Carl, despite his condition, was a gentle soul. His eyes spoke volumes, and in them I saw gratitude and a kind of silent camaraderie. "Hey, Carl, how are we doing today?" I'd ask, trying to keep the mood light as I went about my tasks. Carl couldn't respond, but his eyes would follow me, and occasionally there'd be a flicker of something that looked like a smile. "It's just you and me, buddy," I'd say, half joking, half serious. The dynamic duo. But the strain of caregiving, coupled with the isolation of our situation, started to take its toll. George was around less and less, claiming work demands, leaving me to manage the household and Carl's needs on my own. The days turned into a monotonous cycle of caregiving, housework, and waiting for George to come home. Each evening, I'd watch the driveway, hoping for a sign that things would change, that George would find a way to lighten the load. But as the sunset faded to darkness, I'd be left with the chilling realization that I was on my own in this. "Tomorrow's a new day, Clara," I tell myself, clinging to a hope that was as fragile as the silence that filled the house. But with each passing day, that hope dimmed, overshadowed by the reality of my new beginning. The year rolled by like a slow-moving storm, each day blurring into the next. There I was, knee-deep in the endless tasks of caring for Carl, scrubbing floors, and tending to a bunch of pets that seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking. George. He was hardly ever around, always off on some business trip or another. The man was like a ghost, appearing just long enough to remind me he existed, before vanishing again, every month like clockwork. $3,000 would land in my account. It was supposed to be enough. George said enough for what, though? Couldn't even splash out on a new dress for Christmas, let alone anything else. Every penny was accounted for. Every expense had to go through George. Felt like I was more of an accountant than a wife. The few times George did show up, it was like having a stranger in the house. We danced around each other, making small talk that felt as stiff as the collars on the shirts I ironed for him. "George, this isn't working," I finally said one evening as he packed his suitcase for the umpteenth time. "Feels like I'm just the help around here." George, always so smooth, just flashed me that salesman's smile of his. "Clara, babe, you know how it is. The business needs me. But hey, I'm providing, right? You got everything you need." I snorted, folding my arms. "Everything except a husband. What's the point, George? You're never here. This house, it doesn't feel like a home. It's just empty." He paused, his smile faltering for a moment. "Look, I know it's tough, but it's all going to pay off, you'll see. Just gotta hang in there a bit longer." Hang in there. I was hanging by a thread, But arguing with George was like talking to a brick wall, so I let it go, watched him zip up his suitcase and head out the door, leaving me in the silence of the big empty house. Days turned into nights, and I kept on keeping on, caring for Carl, who, despite everything, was the closest thing to company I had. The pets, at least, didn't care that my conversations were one-sided. They were happy just to be fed and fussed over. But it wore on me, the loneliness, the monotony. I felt trapped in a life I hadn't chosen, a life that was chosen for me by a man who saw me more as a convenience than a partner. "Carl, what am I doing here?" I'd ask, half expecting him to answer. Of course he never did, but it was comforting to pretend, to imagine a life where the choices were mine to make. As the year mark approached, I took stock of my life. I was a caregiver, a housekeeper, a maid in a house that didn't feel like mine, my husband a ghost only present in the money he sent, and the brief visits that left me feeling more alone than ever. That year, as autumn turned the leaves golden, a letter arrived that would flip my world upside down. It was addressed to Carl, but with George away as usual, curiosity got the better of me. The envelope was thick, official-looking. I turned it over in my hands, debating before slicing it open. Inside, a letter from a lawyer, something about a visit, and discussing important matters concerning Carl's estate. I muttered to myself, glancing over at Carl, who was watching me with those knowing eyes of his. "Looks like you've got some fancy lawyer wanting to chat, Carl. Wonder what that's about." For a moment, I considered calling George, but something held me back. Instead, I wheeled Carl closer, reading the letter out loud to him. When I finished, Carl did something he hadn't done in a long time. He moved his hand weakly, gesturing for me to put the letter down, and not to call George. "You don't want me to call him?" I asked, surprised. Carl managed another weak gesture, a confirmation. It was the most communication we'd had in months, and it left me more puzzled than ever. A few days later, the lawyer arrived, a Mr. Thompson, carrying a briefcase and wearing a look of sullen importance. I showed him into the living room where Carl was already waiting, the letter on his lap. "Mrs. Clara Smith," Mr. Thompson began, then paused, checking his notes. "I'm here to discuss Mr. Carl Jackson's affairs." I nodded, feeling out of my depth. "Yes, I've been taking care of Carl. George is away on business." "I see. Well, it's imperative Carl is part of this discussion. It concerns his estate and his well-being," Mr. Thompson said, opening his briefcase. As the lawyer laid out documents, I sat stunned as he explained the truth. Carl, it turned out, was the wealthy owner of the house and much more besides. George, on the other hand, was not the brother he claimed to be, but a hired caretaker, paid handsomely to look after Carl. And there I was, playing the maid, the nurse, the everything under false pretenses. "Wait, so you're telling me this whole setup, George pretending to be Carl's brother, it's all been a lie?" I asked, my voice rising with each word. "Indeed, Mrs. Smith, I'm afraid you've been misled. Carl here is my client, and he's been under the care of George, whom we've been paying a significant sum to ensure Carl receives the best care possible," Mr. Thompson explained, not unkindly. "And what about me?" "I've been doing all the work," I interjected, my voice trailing off as the anger and betrayal settled in. "Does this mean I'm just—" "What, exactly?" "Unfortunately, it appears you've been unknowingly drawn into this deception. This is a matter we need to rectify for Carl's sake and for legal reasons," Mr. Thompson continued, glancing sympathetically at me, then at Carl. The room spun as the implications of Mr. Thompson's words sunk in. All this time, George had been using me, using us for his own gain, and Carl, unable to speak for himself, had been trapped in this lie alongside me. "So, what happens now?" I asked, feeling a mix of fear, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "We will need to reassess Carl's care arrangements, including revisiting the financial agreements," Mr. Thompson said, closing his briefcase with a final click as the lawyer left, promising to be in touch with next steps. I turned to Carl, tears in my eyes. "I'm so sorry, Carl. I had no idea. We'll sort this out, I promise." Carl's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a glimmer of something like forgiveness or maybe just understanding. It was a small comfort, but in that moment it was all I had. After the bombshell Mr. Thompson dropped about my entire life being a lie, he hit me with another gut punch. "Unfortunately, you'll have to leave the house," he said, his voice all business, no warmth. Panic gripped me like a vice. Leave to where? My apartment, my little bit of independence, was gone, sold because of George's sweet-talking lies. I gave in everything, and now I was about to be left with nothing. That night, I cried until the tears wouldn't come any more. My heart a mix of hurt, betrayal, and fear. By morning, desperation replaced despair. I had to do something, anything. With shaky resolve, I approached Carl, even though he couldn't respond. "Carl, I have got nowhere to go," I started, my voice cracking. "I was wondering, maybe, could I work for you officially, I mean? I can take care of you, like I've been doing." It was a shot in the dark, but Carl's eyes, they always seemed to understand more than he let on, and in that moment, they told me I wasn't alone in this mess. Mr. Thompson was called back in, and I laid it all out, raw and unfiltered. I've been doing the job anyway, haven't I? Taking care of Carl, the house, everything. I need this job. Plus, you won't find anyone who cares about Carl more than me. To my surprise, Mr. Thompson didn't immediately shut me down. Instead, he nodded, tapping his pen against his chin. "Let's see what we can arrange. It's an unusual situation, but given the circumstances, it might be the best solution for Carl." The next few days were a whirlwind. Mr. Thompson worked with Carl's legal team to draft a new contract, this time with my name on it as Carl's official caregiver. The salary was more than I'd ever dreamed of, a stark contrast to the measly sums George used to send. When Mr. Thompson handed me the contract, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. "You'll be compensated fairly for your work, and more importantly, you'll have a place to stay," he said, handing me a pen. Signing that contract was the first step towards reclaiming my life, towards something that felt like justice after months of deception. "Thank you," I told Mr. Thompson, and even though Carl couldn't speak, I looked at him, adding, "And thank you, Carl, for giving me a chance." With the ink drying on the contract, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief because I wasn't going to be homeless. Pride because I'd stood up for myself and fought for what I needed. But underneath it all, there was a thread of sadness for the life I thought I'd have with George, for the love I thought was real. In the months following my employment under the official capacity as Carl's caregiver, life took on a routine that was both comforting and challenging. One morning, as I navigated the quiet halls of the large house, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led me here. The weight of my pending divorce and the legal battle against George hung over me like a storm cloud. Yet within these walls, I found peace. "Good morning, Carl," I greeted, entering his room with a tray of breakfast. "How are we feeling today?" Carl's response, as always, was nonverbal, a slight nod and a glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. Over time, I'd learned to understand these subtle cues, the silent language that spoke volumes. As I busied myself with his care, I couldn't help but think about the impending court date. The thought of facing George, of recounting the web of lies and deceit he had woven, filled me with a mixture of dread and determination. The day of the trial arrived with a sense of finality. Standing outside the courtroom, Mr. Thompson at my side, I steeled myself for what was to come. "You ready for this?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice steady and reassuring. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, drawing a deep breath. "It's time to close this chapter once and for all." The proceedings were a blur, a mix of legal jargon and cold, hard facts. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke with a clarity and strength I didn't know I possessed. I told the court about George's deception, about the life I was led to believe we would have together, and the reality of my role as an unwitting caretaker. In the end, justice was served. George was convicted of fraud, sentenced to several years behind bars. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of closure that had long eluded me. Life after the trial settled into a new normal. Carl and I continued our daily routines, the house filled with a quiet respect for the bond we shared. And then, just as I had begun to find my footing, Carl passed away. The news of Carl's death was a blow, a painful reminder of the transient nature of life. Yet in his passing, Carl left me a final gift, a gesture of immense generosity. The lawyer informed me that Carl had bequeathed his entire estate to me, a decision that left me stunned and humbly grateful. Sitting in the now quiet house, I realized the full extent of Carl's kindness. He had given me a chance to start anew, to build a life on my own terms. "You've really done it, Carl," I whispered, a mix of sadness and gratitude in my voice. "You've changed everything." As I navigated the challenges of running the shelter I'd founded, I found a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life. Each day brought new challenges, but also new joys. The laughter and barks of animals finding new homes, new beginnings. Life had a funny way of coming full circle, I mused, sitting in the grand living room of the house that once felt like a prison, but now was truly my home. The journey from despair to where I was now, rich not just in wealth, but in experiences, had been nothing short of a roller coaster. One day, as I was reviewing plans for an expansion of the animal shelter, a knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Expecting maybe a delivery or a neighbor, I opened the door to find a figure from my past, someone I thought I'd left behind for good, my ex-husband, George. "Clara, babe, look at you, living in luxury," he started, his eyes greedily taking in the foyer's opulence. "I've been thinking, about how I introduced you to all this. I reckon I'm entitled to a bit of the fortune, don't you think?" I couldn't help but laugh, a short, bitter sound. "Entitled? You've got some nerve showing up here, George, after everything. You really think you can waltz back into my life and demand money?" George shifted uncomfortably, his confidence waning under my gaze. "Come on, Clara. I was the one who brought you into Carl's life. Without me, you wouldn't have any of this." My laughter died, replaced by a steely calm. "Listen here, George. You brought nothing but lies and misery into my life. Everything I have now, I earned through my own hard work and Carl's generosity. You have no claim to any of it." He took a step forward, but I stood my ground. "I'm warning you, George. Leave now, or I'll call the police." For a moment it looked like he might argue further, but then the fight went out of him. With a sneer, he turned and walked away. True to my word, I watched him go and then shut the door firmly behind him. That was the last I ever saw or heard of George. Where he ended up, I didn't care to know. Standing up for myself against George was a turning point. It was the moment I truly felt I had taken control of my life, a stark contrast to the woman I was when I first met him. Now I was using my resources to give back, to offer a second chance to animals in need, much like the second chance I'd been given. Life was good. My son had recently married, and I was about to become a grandmother, a new chapter. I couldn't wait to start. The animal shelter was thriving, a testament to the unexpected path my life had taken. Reflecting on my journey, I felt a deep sense of pride. From the ashes of my old life, I'd built something meaningful, something lasting. I had found happiness not just in the wealth and comfort that surrounded me, but in the knowledge that I was making a difference, both in the lives of animals and in the community around me.